Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to talk to you today about the community releases of Lustre and things going on in that area. My day job is I run the Whamcloud engineering division, which works on the Lustre file system at DDN. I also act as one of the leads on the OpenSFS Lustre working group. So OpenSFS is the global Lustre community organization. And as Robert was touching on, there's people from all kinds of areas now who are using Lustre. But what all of those share in common, even though they may be working in quite diverse areas, is they use these same community releases. Even if they do some customizations to that code for the final usage, they still rely on this strong basic core. So the Lustre working group has been operating for I think about 8 or 9 years now, and it's basically serves as a forum for all interested parties to get together to share experiences, to collaborate, to work out plans relating to those releases. One of the things that we've done is to this was the one earlier this year was the 8th, is to do an annual survey of users. So this data is from March now. We do it that same time every year, so we can do year-on-year comparisons. And this is the latest data. There's a fuller version of this on the OpenSFS wiki if people are interested, but I've just picked out a couple of bits of data from this which I think are still the most interesting and relevant here. So I can't see very well your perspective here, but I think it would be the blue on this chart. This is Lustre versions, so people could have multiple Lustre versions they're using. The blue is the 2018 data, and the red on the right is the 2019 data. And so 2019 data. So what you see, typically the picture you see is that the older releases from 2018 to 2019, the numbers are dropping. Obviously, people are upgrading. Maybe older systems are going out of service. And what you're seeing is a very sharp increase on the 210 code line. So this is, in the community releases, this was designated some years back as being the long-term support version of Lustre. So we did just, at Supercomputing last year, we announced we would be switching to the 212 release to be the next long-term support release. So here we see quite relatively low numbers of 212, as this survey was taken when that release had only been out a couple of months. But through the course of this year, we've seen a lot of people starting to move to the 212 release. And so I would expect to see a strong representation of 212 in the 2020 survey. So this shows sort of features that have come out in recent releases, just to get an indication as to how broadly those features are being used. And maybe sometimes we put a lot of work into these new features, and then we don't get a lot of feedback, and it's unclear whether people are maybe they're using it and it works fine, and so they have no reason to open, bug reports or anything, or maybe there's something that's not quite right to make it useful, and so this is something that gives us some feedback here. And looking at this data, in this case, the red line at the top is if people aren't using it today but expect to be using that feature in the year, within the next coming year, and the blue line is already using today. So the things that really jump out here, there's, over the last few years, we've seen gradually increasing the number of people who are using Lustre on ZFS as that combination has matured. And also we've started to see increasing numbers of people using D&E stripe directories. So that feature originally came out in the Lustre 2.8 release, which was some years back, but we saw very limited adoption for the first couple of years. But now, as I think that's more matured, and I think people are starting to feel the need to scale at the metadata level because of the data on MDT feature and having more more of their capacity taken up with small files there. And then this is another one that's kind of interesting, is this is asking people to categorize the primary purpose that their Lustre deployments are used for. So it's kind of like market segments, I suppose. And so there's a very strong representation here from AI machine learning. That's definitely has come up strongly in the last few of these reports, as we've seen very strong interest in that, and that's been one of the areas as well where there's been a lot of new people coming in to using Lustre. But I think that this survey, although it's very consistent with its sample, the user population that the sample data comes from, the way we promote this is really on the Lustre community mailing lists. And what I'm finding is, the sort of new usages that Robert was outlining previously, people in those areas are not coming from a traditional HPC background who are on the mailing lists and are following Lustre in that same way. They're more using it as a solution in a different context. So if you're using Lustre in the cloud, you're maybe, you're abstracted from what's going on at the community level. So, people in those sectors, that they're not being represented in this. So I know that there's definitely some segments here which, have much stronger usage than is really reflected in this data. Another thing that over the summer, we've had a lot of discussion back and forth and have tried to make more clear is, there's always been a bit of confusion about which Linux distributions we support, and because Lustre is, has a permissive open source license, people maybe have their favored Linux distribution, and it's very, it's possible to maybe either use it without any changes or maybe make some slight adaptations to get it to build correctly, and then it runs. And often we will land those changes in the tree just for convenience to allow people to use that more often. But we just have found there's been some confusion sometimes around, just when we have some code for a certain version, say like Ubuntu servers. There are people who are very interested in that. It's something which we do have a patch series in the Lustre tree at the moment for, but it's not something that we spend focused attention on in vetting the results and carefully working through all the issues. So we basically have taken some steps to clarify the position and mark things so people are suitably warned the difference between something which is much more carefully vetted and something which is more of a use at your own risk technology that may work perfectly well, but sets expectations around the level of testing that you would need to do before you use that in a serious mission critical type situation. So just to talk a bit more about the transition I touched on earlier on from 2.10 to 2.12. When we at first launched the idea of 2.10 being a long-term support release, we didn't have a fixed idea about when we would next shift to a new release. And all we had said is it would be at least 18 months to give some indication. And in the end, it turned out to be 2 years when we did make the switch. And the driver, while there were some interesting features like data on MDT, which helps with small file performance, the real driver was just for newer kernel support. So because of efforts that had been going on for some years to rework the Lustre code to meet kernel coding standards with a view to being able to have a version of the Lustre client in the mainline Linux tree, so much code had been restructured that to be able to pick out the bits that were needed to do the functional changes to support the newer kernels, it would be such a huge amount of changes to be backported to 2.10 that we felt that it was a safer option to start from a cleaner baseline for 2.12 that was the right side of the bulk of all that cleanup work. So, since that's happened and we've started actually producing the 2.12 releases, some people had, at these sort of community events, had raised some concerns that maybe this was a bit quick and they had just moved to 2.10. They didn't want to have to move and they were concerned. So I just wanted to bring up that, just to reassure people that there is no immediate, obligation to have to move. And that's, one of the advantages with the flexibility that Lustre provides to you. Of course, if you work with a vendor, of course, you have support arrangements there. So people who work with a vendor this isn't a concern, but people who are using the software open source maybe do still have flexibility. Many people are choosing to use 2.12 clients and to just keep their servers on 2.10, and that works fine. Then they're still able to use the newer kernels, but without having to do such a significant upgrade. And maybe they can phase in gradually over time to do the switch without taking outages. Maybe as new clients are added to the system, they use the 2.12. So it's a gradual shift over time rather than having to take an outage. And it is possible still, all the changes that are going in are available, the source code's open, and so people are still able to make a change if they want a specific change. Even though 2.10 is a very stable release, we've had 8 maintenance releases on 2.10, but if somebody hit some particular edge case bug and needed to get that fix, rather than upgrade to the newer release containing it, they could, take that patch, apply it to their version they're running, and use that. So, there's definitely a range of options there. So talking about specifics with the community releases, so the release that hopefully will be out any day now is 2.12.3. The release candidate is undergoing testing at the moment, and we're busy triaging issues that we're finding and just checking that everything is okay. So either maybe this will be the GA version, or perhaps there'll be some minor modifications that are needed to get to the GA version, but we're definitely very close. There is quite a lot of interesting stuff in this release because of third-party software releases all coinciding. So there's, Red Hat and CentOS 7.7 server and client support. We also are offering a Red Hat and CentOS 8 client support, and Mellanox OFED 4.7 just was released as well. So all of those things will be supported in this release, which is due out imminently. And then the major release we're working on, hopefully this is 2.13. So hopefully this will be out by supercomputing. We're down to a handful of issues now that we still are working on, and most of those are fairly well understood, and we're just validating fixes. So I think within maybe a week or two we should have a release candidate, and then there is a bit of a longer release testing cycle with the feature releases. Of course, there are new features in this release which do need to get thoroughly tested in this final version, but definitely we're pretty advanced stage, and it's, again, all of this development is being done in the open, so if anyone's interested in these features, it's a good chance to test them prior to the release, and if there are issues to provide that feedback so that we can address those ahead of the release going out. This was some provisional data that's actually a couple of weeks old now, so you'll see larger numbers in the final versions when the release goes out. But just to give you a sense of the diversity that's going on in the Lustre community, so on your left is the lines of code from changes, either additions or deletions of code. And on the right is patch review. So every proposed change needs to go through, before it's able to be landed, needs to complete regression testing, but also have sign-off from a couple of experts in that area of code. And so maybe it takes multiple iterations if defects are identified by the code review before the code lands. So this is, time-consuming but very important work to ensuring the quality of Lustre in the end. So you can see there are, a number of organizations involved, and it's always good to see some new names appearing as well. And one thing that's notable in this release is we actually have seen a couple of the contributions from a couple of the cloud providers. So Amazon Web Services in the US and Cloud, which is part of Alibaba in China, both have had contributions in this release. And this just shows how that data compares to previous releases. You can see that in terms of the number of commits and the lines of code, it's definitely, very, fairly up there. Not the largest release, but definitely there's been quite a bit of activity. But I think that the data I like most about this is, looking back, the 1.8 release 10 years ago, that was the last major release done at Oracle, and every single contribution in that release was made by an engineer who was employed by Oracle. So there's one organization that was responsible for the, participating in that release. And now, this number here is already 24, and the final number may be even slightly higher by the time we have the last number of contributions. So, I think that's a very positive thing across, across for the whole community. This is the latest roadmap, so I won't go into any details here about the actual features themselves. Andreas will be talking in more detail about the actual features, but just to sort of see how things are shaping up for these major releases. We do have some plans now for the 2.14 and 2.15 releases going forward. Our policy usually with these is to identify sort of a couple of larger features that look to be trending on this time frame, and then as we get closer, and there's a lot of development going on in parallel, and sometimes it's hard to predict when it will be available. It's different organizations with different priorities, so we basically have a cutoff as to when we'll accept changes for a given release, as a way, just to be fair across, different organizations. So it makes it a bit hard to be very precise about the release, but typically what we see is there'll be much more content in the release than we initially predict, but we're just giving a rough idea of, some of the bigger items and roughly, when we expect them to be available. So touched a little about, I mentioned earlier about Lustre in the Linux kernel. So there's been quite a bit of activity going on here still. And so Neil Brown at SUSE, who's a very experienced kernel maintainer, has been leading this effort, working very closely with James Simmons at Oak Ridge National Labs in the US. And Neil is based in Australia. And so previously there'd been an effort in this area which had involved interacting with the Linux staging area process, and that had been very challenging. Lustre's a very large, complicated code base, and the staging area maintainers are more sort of Linux generalists and not file system experts. It was a very slow process. So we've basically taken this different approach here. So Neil's very familiar with the sort of mechanics of how the upstream Linux kernel community works. He's convinced that when it's in a state that it's deemed ready, that he'll be able to get it straight into the mainline kernel and avoiding the whole staging area altogether. And anyone who's on the Lustre Develop mailing list will see there's a very constant stream of patches as they're continuing to move along with that work. Also, in a similar area with the upstream Linux, we've had a couple of the very largest patches for LDISC of S have been accepted upstream, and so we do still have a patch delta with the Lustre E2FS progs, but it's a very small delta now, so we are actually able to keep fairly close up with the new versions as they come out, and it does look like we have line of sight now to possibly eliminating that and being able to use the vanilla version at some point in the future. Lustre in the cloud. So yes, I mentioned AWS and Alibaba earlier on. Amazon announced just about a year ago their FSX for Lustre offering, and talking to them, it seems like that's been very successful for them. And the interesting thing here is this really makes Lustre a lot more accessible to people who perhaps wouldn't have considered using it before. So we're definitely seeing a lot, and certainly from back when I was at Intel and we launched our own Lustre offering in early 2015, we definitely had that same experience that our customers we've had from then, and still have moved with us over to DDN. definitely they're in a different sort of space. They wouldn't normally have considered using Lustre, but having it packaged and provided in that way has meant it's practical for them to actually get the performance benefits from using that software. IML this originally was a proprietary tool, so many people hadn't, unless you were buying the Intel branded Lustre releases, and then again it depended on which partner you were working with, whether this was part of the offering that was provided. So many people weren't using this as necessarily. This is a monitoring and management and monitoring tool. And but this was open sourced a couple of years ago, and we're starting to see a development community building up around this software as well, which is great. The core engineering still is in my group at Whamcloud. We're seeing a lot of work going into new versions to support the newer versions and to make this more accessible. One of the major areas of development right now is to be able to have this remove the limitation. Previously, you only could use IML for management if IML had done the initial deployment, which was, for established file systems meant it was not possible not to consider it. But there's development going on now which will allow it to just identify what's happened with the file system and take over management responsibilities. So I think that will see even broader adoption of this software. So the last major release was the 5.0 release in May, which added the support for the new LTS release of 2.12. And again, IML 5.1 is due out any day now, possibly even today or tomorrow. And finally, I always like to give a plug anytime I speak about documentation. So anytime, sometimes people mention that they've tried to follow instructions and they haven't been accurate. And so I know in terms of contribution to the release, I know not everyone has the inclination to become a file system kernel developer, but certainly if you're trying to follow instructions and they're not accurate, letting us know about that so we can get that corrected, is a big help in terms of, can prevent somebody else having that frustration from that experience. So just to encourage you, if you do ever find yourself in that position, to please, please speak up. And then, oh yes, I put this in as a bit of a joke, I suppose. This was this picture here. What it really is an old picture from online of the developers of the video game Pong. But this was sent to a customer and friend of mine who by a salesperson from a competing technology. And so I think that the intention of this was to suggest that, maybe Lustre was a bit old-fashioned and not as cool and exciting as that technology. But my friend who forwarded it to me made the point, which I agree with very much, that this is the exact opposite of what you should be looking for when you're considering what to use for a file system, and having something which is more proven at running in, at scale with the most intense, workloads. You can imagine that's exactly what you want. So it takes a long time to mature a file system. And so having something that has been around a while is actually a positive, not a negative. So, and then to that end as well, this cute picture of the birthday cake down below was actually Andreas's. He came up with this for his talk he gave at ISC this year. So it was actually the same week as, I believe, as the 20th anniversary of the first ever commit in the Lustre the Lustre repository. So hence the birthday cake. And this link here, if you can get at that for when the slides are posted, I suggest you have a look through that. It's a very interesting talk, having a recap over the early years of Lustre. So some of it was new to me. I joined CFS in 2006, so I missed some of the really old stuff there. And it was also an interesting look forward to where sort of even the longer term view than perhaps Andreas will touch on. The talks he routinely gives at these sort of events are focusing on features which are, planned out and actually actively being worked on, but this is, a bit longer term. So definitely encourage you to seek that out. So just to recap, the LTS model, we feel that's been very well adopted. We're seeing that vendors seem to be using those as the basis for their offerings, and the open source users definitely have been using those. They've been very popular with them in terms of what they're using. And we have IML 5.1 and the Lustre 2.12.3 should be out in a matter of days, and the Lustre 2.13 should be out in a matter of weeks. And just to say, if there's anyone, to again promote what we do with the Lustre Working Group, and this is the website here for that organization. So if you want to read the minutes of the meetings or join the mailing list, or even, dial in and start participating more actively, we'd be, very welcome to have you along, and I'm happy to chat on the breaks or afterwards if you want to have some questions around that. And I will take questions now, but equally again, if you'd rather talk on a break, I'm happy to do that too.